Hey there, students. This is Mr. Nutzel, and I just want to go over the main notes for the nature of science. Some of you have already finished this, but I just want to go over and talk over and highlight some of the parts that I think are important and interesting. So this goes over Chapter 1, Section 1 of the book. You have a copy of the book that is also connected up to your vocabulary assignment. And here are the vocab terms for this section. And when you're doing your vocab assignment, 1-1 vocab, you're going to be defining these based on what the book says, and then also you can use an online definition. So every time we do vocab, you're going to define the words twice. So science is a process based on inquiry that helps develop explanations about events in nature. That's my definition of science. And there's a couple parts I think that are important. First is it's talking about stuff in nature. Science is concerned with understanding the natural world around us. A second part is it's based on inquiry. That's about questioning. Ultimately, these questioning is so we can come up with explanations. Jacques Cousteau has a great quote here. It says, "What is a scientist after all? It is a curious man looking through a keyhole, the keyhole of nature, trying to know what's going on." Okay, and anyone trying to look at nature, trying to figure out what's going on, that's an act of science. Okay, once again, a scientist is someone who observes the world, questions what they see, and then attempts to find explanations. So a lot of people observe the world and try and explain it. And if you're doing all those things, if you're trying to, as you're looking at the world and questioning what's going on and trying to find an explanation, if you're doing those things about the natural world, then you're acting as a scientist. A lot of people have a view of a scientist as some old white guy in a lab coat with crazy hair, kind of like Einstein in the background, but that doesn't have to be what a scientist can be. Anyone can be a scientist. Science, the word science comes from the Latin word scientia, which means to know. And we break up science into a couple different branches of science. Okay, there's three main branches of science. The first one would be life science or biology. All of you had to take this as freshmen. Life science is when you're studying living things. Plants, animals, cells, viruses, all that stuff would fall under biology. Earth science is when you're studying the earth and all that makes it up. Tectonic plates, oceans, rocks, minerals, actually stars and planets and moons could all be considered earth science. It's not necessarily our earth, but all of that stuff. And then we also have physical science. Physical science can be broken up into two sections: the study of chemistry and the study of matter, which would be chemistry, and the study of motion or energy, that would be physics. Chemistry is going to be focusing more on elements, compounds, and phase changes and reactions, while physics is focused more on motion, forces, momentum, energy, all that stuff. And then scientific methods are ways in which you go about thinking about problems and solving. One thing that I feel like a lot of science teachers stress or say is that there's this one scientific method that goes in a nice linear fashion. I don't believe that most science happens that way. Science is a kind of a feedback loop where you got testing ideas can go into community analysis, which might go into exploration, which could go into more testing ideas, which could jump into benefits and outcomes. Now, I'm going to talk about the scientific method as these 6 steps, and that's kind of a generic way of saying it. So if you're looking at the generic version, basically science would be a basic scientific method would be stating the problem, gathering information, forming a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis, analyzing the data, and then forming a conclusion. So those 6 steps can summarize what's going on in this complex or this loop version. Okay. However, it's not like every scientist has to follow these 6 steps. They're a pattern, but they're not the only way. With that said, I am going to use those because your book talks about it, and I feel like it can be valuable. So the first step, generic step, is to state a problem. That's when you're observing the world and you're finding something to wonder about. One example could be, why do some plants grow taller? That could be a question that somebody asks, and a scientific question that somebody asks, and they want to go and research. Before trying to develop their answer, you might look at what others have already suggested. And then the next step would be to go ahead and come up with some sort of hypothesis. If you don't find a satisfactory answer, you can make an educated guess or a hypothesis on what you think is the specific answer. So this person who's trying to do this scientific questions asks the question, what if it's the type of fertilizer that is used? Okay, so then you have to develop a test or a method of verifying your answer, and this should be with something that you can get repeatable evidence. For example, this person who was they said, I'm going to come up with a test for different fertilizers with different plants. Okay, and when you're starting to get into testing, you have to talk about variables. Okay, there's two basic types of variables. The independent variable, that's the one that you're purposely changing on purpose. And then there's the dependent variable, that's what you're measuring to see how it responds. A control is an experiment that doesn't have an independent variable. That's the kind of standard that you're comparing everything to. And then the constant would be all other variables that could change. We call them all the other variables should be constants, because if you're doing a scientific test, you only want to change one variable at a time, because then you can identify what's actually causing the change. Okay, and then you have to look at the results. That's what analysis is, looking at the results that you obtained and think critically about them. One easy way to do that is to make a graph and show what's going on. So this is the person who wanted to go ahead and test different fertilizers. They used the same plant. They have the amount of water, the amount of sun, the fertilizer type, and the height after 2 weeks. All the variables are what are listed at the top. Okay, so these are all things that could change. It's not what they changed, but there are things that could change. The independent variable, the thing that they were testing, was the fertilizer type, either fertilizer A, B, or C. The dependent variable is what is the height after the 2 weeks. So if we keep these other things, the other things are the constants. The control was we used no fertilizer on one plant, and that one plant had a final height of 10 inches. Okay. The constants, we use the same type of plant. It's plant A, plant B, plant C, or D. They're all maybe a pea plant or a corn. I don't know what the plant is, but they all get the same amount of water and they get the same amount of sunlight. The only thing that we're changing is the fertilizer type. So the independent variable, once again, was the type of fertilizer. The dependent was the height that we were measuring. The control setup was when we had no fertilizer, and then same plant, same environment, same water, all that stuff, that was all held constant. Okay, so then we go and graph our data. So as we look at our graph, you can pretty quickly see which fertilizer worked best. It's going to be C because it has the greatest height over that time, and everything else was kept constant. So for this plant, fertilizer C would have been the best. Okay. Lastly, is we draw our conclusion based on the analysis of the evidence. What is it that we can now definitively say? And that would be fertilizer C worked the best. Okay. So the scientific method, again, doesn't always follow that same predictable path. It's generally more of a guideline for a process about how you think about ideas. This is the in-depth scientific method, and you can start with any of these spots and go from one to another. And we're going to talk more about this next week in week 2 as we go into looking at how does science work and how does some investigation happen. And we got a story that article that you'll be reading and using this to map out one scientist or a group of scientists' journey through the scientific method. So finally, based on the analysis of many experiments that the community of scientists With those, they can develop what's called theories or laws. Generally, theories tend to line up more with an explanation, and a law is some sort of predictable pattern. Like Newton's second law is force is equals mass times acceleration. So if you know the mass and the acceleration of an object, you can calculate the force. That's a law. A theory would be more of, hey, based on our evidence, this is why things are happening. Okay, which is just what I said. However, I do want to point out that scientists don't use the word theory lightly. It's based on lots of observations. That's when they would use the word theory. And if they can be used to predict behavior, that would be a scientific law. Okay, that's all that we have for you in this slideshow and this stuff. So hopefully you understand. And yeah, thanks for listening.